Hello everyone. In this presentation I'm going to talk about Japan's oldest major anthology of waka poetry, Manyoshu, which translates into English as the anthology or collection of a myriad leaves, or, according to some theories, the collection of a myriad rains. I should say at the outset that there are numerous scholars in Japan who spend their entire careers on Manyoshu research, or even on specific parts of it, so all I'm going to be able to do in these presentations is provide an extremely brief and cursory introduction to what is a fascinating and complex text. With that proviso in place, let's get started. Let's start at the very beginning and ask the question, what is Manyoshu? Well, the simple answer is, as I have said above, that it's Japan's oldest major anthology of waka poetry, although in fact it contains more than just waka. There are different textual traditions for the anthology, containing slightly variant numbers of poems, but the majority of modern editions contain 4,536 waka, 4 Chinese poems, and 22 passages of Chinese prose, organised into 20 books. It was this model which probably set the pattern for the 20-book structure of the vast majority of subsequent imperial anthologies. There is evidence to support the argument that Manyoshu was compiled both from a number of pre-existing earlier waka collections, which are now lost, and was as well the result of the individual efforts of one or more compilers. Given the text's age and complexity, there are a number of different ways of analysing its organisation and composition. The most simple way is chronologically, so if we think about the period which its content covers, then this can be broadly divided into 4. The first period is the longest, going back to the semi-mythological beginnings of the early Japanese state in the mid to late 5th century, and then moving forward to historical periods we can talk about with more assurance in the early to mid 7th century. Many of the works from this period are by people at the very pinnacle of the Yamato state. Emperors, princes, empresses, and senior nobles, suggesting either that such individuals were so important that their poetry simply had to be recorded, or that literacy was not widespread enough during this period for anyone else to be writing. The second period is essentially the last 2 decades of the 7th century. This is dominated by the work of a single poet, Kaki no Moto no Hitomaro, about whom I will talk later in more detail. Suffice it to say for now that in Hitomaro's hands, a number of key features of manual poetry reached a form of maturity. The next period covers about the first 3 decades of the 8th century and features work by the majority of the remaining significant named manual poets. It is during this period that we begin to see more clearly the influence of Sinitic models on the work produced by Japanese poets, suggesting this was a period of greater contact with and borrowing from continental culture. The final period covers the next 30 years of the 8th century from about 730 to 759. This period is dominated by the work of a single major poet, Otomono Yakamochi, which is not entirely surprising as he is believed to have been the anthology's final compiler and was thus able to decide what was and was not contained within it, or rather within the sections he was most directly involved in producing and arranging. While Manyoshu's latest datable poem was produced in 759, it also contains a substantial number of compositions which are anonymous and have no definite editorial apparatus, so we simply do not know when they were composed. Nevertheless, the latter half of the 8th century is a reasonable cut-off point, chronologically, for its contents. The account of the anthology's chronology, which I have given above, represents what perhaps can be called the traditional view of its organisation, but more recent scholarship has pointed out a number of weaknesses with this, in that some parts, particularly in the first 2 volumes, a strict temporal chronology is not followed. Some scholars dismiss this as the result of mere aberrations, but others suggest that if these volumes are viewed more as an imperial dynastic history, then some of the chronological anomalies disappear, as the sequencing of poems replicates closely the vicissitudes of various different claimants to the imperial throne, some of whom ascended to it and some of whom did not. There are other ways of looking at Manyorshu's contents, deriving from the ways in which the compilers have attempted to impose a range of classifications and structures onto the poems which they collected. Unlike in all subsequent imperial anthologies, however, topic is not the main organising principle. Instead, broadly and crudely speaking, the anthology is organised partly chronologically, the first two volumes are recognised as being the oldest, and also by a broad classification of poems into three types, although this does not apply uniformly to all of the 20 books within it. The three types of poems are banka, elegies, sormonka, which literally translates as question and response poem, but is a catch-all term for compositions expressing individuals' emotions. Most of these are love poems, but works covering feelings for one's parents and children also come under this heading too. Finally, there is a third category of zorka, miscellaneous poems, which is something of a catch-all for any poems not included in either of the first two groups. That these three categorizations are used at all is evidence of the influence of Chinese poetics on the compilation of the anthology, because all three derive ultimately from China. This means that sometimes individual poems appear to have been shoehorned into one of these categories, even though the fit is poor. Again, proponents of the view that Manyorshu represents an attempt to portray a national realm with the person of the emperor at its heart argue that some of these seemingly anomalous identifications or ill-fitting categorizations of individual poems can be resolved if the miscellaneous category of poems is taken to mean poems about the sovereign's other activities, that is, anything not covered by mourning or being mourned, being praised, or engaging in amorous exchanges. As is the case with subsequent imperial anthologies, poems in Manyorshu often have headnotes, which provide information on who has written a poem, what it's about, and the type of poem that it is. The anthology also makes use of endnotes to some poems for editorial commentary on matters such as whether there are variant versions of a poem in existence or whether the poem was originally included in another collection. It's unclear when these head and endnotes were added, although the scholarly consensus is that it is likely that editorial apparatus was being added to the entire collection throughout the entire period it was being compiled. In fact, this is a process which never really stopped, as further commentary, glosses and other explanatory material continued to be added to manual manuscripts throughout the Heian period and beyond. What this means is that it's not really possible to talk of a date or year when the anthology was finished. There are two linguistic features of Manyorshu which require initial mention. First, there is its language. The language of Manyorshu is technically known as Old Japanese, and its syntax and vocabulary is significantly more remote from modern Japanese compared to the language of the Heian period, which formed the model for all subsequent forms of literary Japanese, more or less right up to 1945. While it is archaic syntax and vocabulary which are the most immediately apparent to modern readers, it's also the case that the Japanese language as spoken during the Old Japanese period was phonologically different from later periods of the language, in that it had 8 vowels rather than the current 5. In addition, consonant usage was somewhat different, meaning that manual Waka would sound very different and even alien to modern ears if read with an historically accurate pronunciation. The reason we know that Old Japanese was pronounced differently from that of later periods derives in part from the script which was used to write Manyorshu. At this point in Japanese history, the kana syllabary had yet to be invented, and so the manual poets had no option but to use kanji characters. The result is a complicated hybrid writing system, which is known as Manyorgana, after the anthology itself. Some of the characters are used semantically, that is for their meanings, and so would have been read as native Japanese words, while others are used phonetically to spell words out according to how the characters were read with the Chinese pronunciations of the time. The resulting script is cumbersome for anyone who has not experienced anything else, And it is clear that even the Japanese found it so, as it was swiftly abandoned once kana had been invented. Nevertheless, it's due to these phonetic elements of manual poetry that we know as much as we do about Old Japanese phonology, and so quite apart from its value as a literary text, Manyoshu is the most significant resource for the study of Old Japanese. Even so, there are still passages of some poems in Manyoshu which have defeated modern scholarship, and so we simply don't know how they are read or what they mean. It's complexities such as this which makes the anthology an enduring object of research, scholarship and study. Of all the major pre-modern poetry anthologies, Manyoshu is probably the one which is held in most affection by the Japanese today, for a number of reasons. First, as part of the reaction against the existing order which coincided with the overthrowing of the Tokugawa government and the restoration of supposed imperial rule in the late 19th century, Manyoshu was championed by a strain of Japanese scholarship as being more authentically Japanese than the Waka poetry which had been being composed by the court and elite since the 10th century. This strand of scholarship was magnified during Japan's ultranationalist period in the 1930s and early 1940s, when anything which had even a hint of foreign influence was regarded with suspicion. As a result, it was manual poetry which was promoted and taught above all during this period, and this was also when the first texts of the Manyoshu became available for popular consumption. I once interviewed a gentleman who had been in the Imperial Army during the 1930s, and he told me that the one book that he took to China when he was sent to fight was a paperback copy of Manyoshu, which he read both to himself and to his comrades when they were off duty. In addition, the collected death poems of Tokkotai, pilots, commonly known as kamikaze in English, are entitled Tokko Manyoshu, a special attack squad's collection of the Myriad Leaves, which is a further demonstration of the connections which were made between the anthology and Japan's ultranationalism and militarism. So there is a legacy of affection among certain parts of the Japanese population for Manyoshu as a result of this promotion in the 1930s and 40s. It's also true, however, that it is Manyoshu as a complete work, and also as individual poems, which has been most widely adopted by localities in Japan for tourism promotion purposes. So it's not unusual to find Waka from Manyoshu inscribed on stones and boulders as public monuments and as tourist attractions. There are even photo blogs by people who travel around the country to find and record them. There are also over 30 botanical gardens throughout the country, dedicated to displaying the plants which are mentioned in the anthology's poems, as well as some of those poems too. I've done some research on these, and you can find the results on my website in the Waka tourism section. There's also a section on manual plants as well. Thus, modern Japanese have significantly more opportunities to encounter poems from Manyoshu in their daily lives than they do those of the court anthologies of the Heian period and later. There is somewhat more to it, however, than simply the legacy of ultranationalist education and tourism promotion. One of the reasons that Manyoshu was lionised after the Meiji Restoration in 1868 was because its sentiments were felt to be more vital and energetic, more masculine than those of court Waka, which were criticised as being too focused on the expression of delicate sentiments and thus too feminine to be appropriate for the new muscular Japanese state. There is an element of truth in this, in that Manyoshu represents a very early stage of Japanese poetry, which was produced by a society which was somewhat more in flux than that of the Heian period. The emotions and sentiments which many manual poems express are more direct, and in some cases it's even possible to say crude, than those expressed by the poets of later ages. In fact, this led the Waka poets of the Heian court to look down upon Manyoshu, in some respects, as a collection of barbaric, one could even say frightening, doggerel. By the late 12th century, we see vigorous debates going on between poets about the appropriateness of using manual poems for elusive variation, the appropriateness of including manual diction in contemporary poems, and even the meaning of some of these words. To a certain extent, this is because, even as early as the 10th century, the knowledge of how to read manual Ghana had been lost by the majority of the court nobility, and so the anthology's text was completely opaque to them. Early work on producing a version of Manual Shu in combined kana and kanji script, as well as commentary and explanation for what its poems actually meant, was done by a poet and scholar by the name of Minamoto no Shitago. He also published Japan's first dictionary, Wamyo Ruijisho, Japanese names for things, classified and annotated, but manual textual studies continued to be an interest for the scholarly inclined throughout the Heian period, even as it is today. In any case, it is this quality of directness and vitality that makes Manual Shu attractive to people today, despite the remoteness and difficulty of its language. It is also the case that, in some respects, Manual Shu is a more Japanese anthology than those which came after it, in the sense that it's the one which is least strongly influenced by Buddhist themes and ideas, and which most clearly and directly expresses Shinto ones, although I'll add the proviso that some scholars would disagree that there is anything which could be so crudely described as a Shinto idea. On the other hand, it's also clearly nonsensical to say that Manual Shu is free from continental influence and ideas, given its extensive Chinese content, the influence of Chinese poetics over its classifications, and the expression of continental ideas and philosophies, principally Taoist and Confucian, in a number of its poems, to say nothing of the fact that many of its poets had either immigrated to Japan from the continent or descended very closely from those who had. These inconvenient facts, however, tend to be dismissed by scholars, both Japanese and not, who wish to portray the anthology as representative of Japanese purity. This orthodox view of the text tends to align with the chronological view of the text's organisation and portray the anthology as a repository of national literature, demonstrating its evolution from an early oral tradition into the more refined and delicate sentiments expressed by the court and nobility of the late Nara period, and which gave rise to later court waka. Turning to the anthology's formal content, there is another way in which Manual Shu is more vital than later court anthologies, in that it contains a wider variety of poetic forms than do later collections. This is because it was produced at a time before the 57577 syllable waka had become the only acceptable vehicle for poetic expression. As well as a handful of poems in minor variant forms and 4,207 waka, it also contains 265 nagauta or choka. If you remember my What is a Waka video, then you will remember that these are poems which repeat alternating lines of 5 and 7 syllables before ending with a final 7/7. This form allowed poets to utilise more extended description and a wider range of rhetorical techniques than did the shorter waka, because of its length. Hitomaro is perhaps the greatest proponent of the nagauta, as we shall see later. Finally, there is one further way in which Manual Shu is more vital than later anthologies. It contains poems by people from a wider range of social classes than they do. Thus, for example, it contains 98 Sakimori Uta, border guard poems, which are poems written by men who were conscripted into service to guard the borders of the Yamato state in either the north or south of the country. As an aside, these poems are an extremely valuable linguistic resource, as many contain elements which reveal facets of dialects of Old Japanese which were spoken by people outside of the central Yamato area around Nara, even though it seems likely that many of them were polished by one of the compilers, generally thought to be Yakamochi, to make them more comprehensible and palatable to the anthology's readership in the capital. Work by people of such low social status was not publicly included in any of the subsequent later court anthologies, and thus it's not surprising that they present a narrower view of the world than Manual Shu does. With that being said, other scholars point out that Manual Shu's poems tend to come from two social groups: the imperial family and those very closely connected to them, and a broader mass of the common people, although this group is relatively loosely defined and includes the lower ranking nobility. They point out that this representation supports the view of the anthology as a project aimed at legitimising and authenticating the power and position of the imperial house, because it presents a binary bifurcation between sovereign and subjects, while omitting the mid-ranking and lower echelons of the senior nobility. That concludes my introductory remarks about the anthology, so now might be a good time to take a quick break before continuing.